Someday, from While the Billy Boils, by Henry Lawson. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Someday, by Henry Lawson. The two travelers had yarned late in their camp, and the moon was getting low down through the mulga. Mitchell's mate had just finished a rather racy yarn, but it seemed to fall flat on Mitchell. He was in a sentimental mood. He smoked a while, and thought, and then said, there was one little girl that I was properly stuck on. She came to our place on a visit to my sister. I think she was the best little girl that ever lived, and about the prettiest. She was just 18 and didn't come up to my shoulder, the biggest blue eyes you ever saw, and she had hair that reached down to her knees, and so thick you couldn't span it with your two hands, brown and glossy, and her skin was like lilies and roses. Of course, I never thought she'd look at a rough, ugly, ignorant brute like me, and I used to keep out of her way and act a little stiff towards her. I didn't want the others to think I had gone on her, because I knew they'd laugh at me, and maybe she'd laugh at me more than all. She would come and talk to me and sit near me at the table, but I thought that was on account of her good nature, and she pitied me because I was such a rough, awkward chap. I was gone on that girl, and no joking, and I felt quite proud to think she was a countrywoman of mine. But I wouldn't let her know that, for I felt sure she'd only laugh. Well, things went on till I got an offer of 2 or 3 years' work on a station up near the border, and I had to go, for I was hard up. Besides, I wanted to get away. Stopping round where she was only made me miserable. The night I left, they were all down at the station to see me off, including the girl I was gone on. When the train was ready to start, she was standing away by herself on the dark end of the platform, and my sister kept nudging me and winking and fooling around, but I didn't know what she was driving at. At last she said, "Go and speak to her, you noodle. Go and say good-bye to Edie." So I went up to where she was, and when the others turned their backs, "Well, good-bye, Miss Brown," I said, holding out my hand. "I don't suppose I'll ever see you again, for the Lord knows when I'll be back. Thank you for coming to see me off." Just then she turned her face to the light, and I could see she was crying. She was trembling all over. Suddenly she said, "Jack! Jack!" just like that, and held her arms up like this. Mitchell was speaking in a tone of voice that didn't belong to him, and his mate looked up. Mitchell's face was solemn, and his eyes were fixed on the fire. "I suppose you gave her a big hug, then, and a kiss?" asked the mate. "I suppose so," snapped Mitchell. "There is some things a man doesn't want to joke about. Well, I think we'll shove on one of the billies and have a drink of tea before we turn in." "I suppose," said Mitchell's mate as they drank their tea, "I suppose you'll go back and marry her some day." "Someday, that's it. It looks like it, doesn't it? We all say someday. I used to say it 10 years ago, and look at me now. I have been knocking around for 5 years, and the last 2 years constant on the track, and no show of getting off it unless I go for good. And what have I got for it? I look like going home and getting married, without a penny in my pocket, or a rag to my back scarcely, and no show of getting them. I swore I'd never go back home without a check, and, what's more, I never will. But the check days are past. Look at that boot. If we were down among the settled district, we'd be called tramps and beggars, and what's the difference? I've been a fool, I know, but I paid for it, and now there's nothing for it but to tramp, tramp, tramp for your tucker, and keep tramping till you get old and careless and dirty, and older and more careless and dirtier, and you get used to the dust and the sand and the heat and the flies and the mosquitoes, just as a bullock does, and lose ambition and hope and get contented with this animal life like a dog, until your swag seems part of yourself, and you'd be lost and uneasy and light-shouldered without it, and you don't care a damn if you ever get work again, or live like a Christian, and you go on like this till the spirit of a bullock takes the place of the heart of a man. Who cares? If we hadn't found the track yesterday, we might have lain and rotted in that lignum, and no one would have been any the wiser, or sorrier. Who knows? Somebody might have found us in the end, but it mightn't have been worth his while to go out of his way and report us. Damn the world, say I." He smoked for a while in savage silence. Then he knocked the ashes out of his pipe, felt for his tobacco with a sigh, and said, "Well, I am a bit out of sorts tonight. I've been thinking. I think we'd best turn in, old man. We've got a long, dry stretch before us tomorrow." They rolled out their swags on the sand, lay down, and wrapped themselves in their blankets. Mitchell covered his face with a piece of calico, because the moonlight and wind kept him awake. The End of Some Day by Henry Lawson.
The Stranger's Latchkey by R. Austin Freeman. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Stranger's Latchkey. The contrariety of human nature is a subject that has given a surprising amount of occupation to makers of proverbs and to those moral philosophers who make it their province to discover and expound the glaringly obvious. And especially they have been concerned to enlarge upon that form of perverseness which engenders dislike of things offered under compulsion, and arouses desire of them as soon as their attainment becomes difficult or impossible. They assure us that a man who has had a given thing within his reach and put it by, will, as soon as it is beyond his reach, find it the one thing necessary and desirable. Even as the domestic cat which has turned disdainfully from the preferred saucer may presently be seen with her head jammed hard in the milk-jug, or secretly and with horrible relish slaking her thirst at the scullery sink. To this peculiarity of the human mind was due, no doubt, the fact that no sooner had I abandoned the clinical side of my profession in favour of the legal, and taken up my abode in the chambers of my friend Thorndyke, the famous medico-legal expert, to act as his assistant or junior, than my former mode of life, that of a locum tenens, or minder of other men's practices, which had, when I was following it, seemed intolerably irksome, now appeared to possess many desirable features, and I found myself occasionally hankering to sit once more by the bedside, to puzzle out the perplexing train of symptoms, and to wield that power, the greatest after all possessed by man, the power to banish suffering and ward off the approach of death itself. Hence it was that on a certain morning of the long vacation I found myself installed at the Larches, Burling, in full charge of the practice of my old friend Dr. Hanshaw, who was taking a fishing holiday in Norway. I was not left desolate, however, for Mrs. Hanshaw remained at her post, and the roomy, old-fashioned house accommodated 3 visitors in addition. One of these was Dr. Hanshaw's sister, a Mrs. Haldane, the widow of a wealthy Manchester cotton factor. The second was her niece by marriage, Miss Lucy Haldane, a very handsome and charming girl of 23, while the third was no less a person than Master Fred, the only child of Mrs. Haldane, and a strapping boy of 6. "It is quite like old times, and very pleasant old times," to see you sitting at our breakfast table, Dr. Jervis." With these gracious words and a friendly smile, Mrs. Hanshaw handed me my teacup. I bowed. "The highest pleasure of the altruist," I replied, "is in contemplating the good fortune of others." Mrs. Haldean laughed. "Thank you," she said. "You are quite unchanged, I perceive. Still as suave and shall I say, oleaginous?" "No, please don't," I exclaimed in a tone of alarm. "Then I won't. But what does Dr. Thorndyke say to this backsliding on your part? How does he regard this relapse from medical jurisprudence to common general practice?" "Thorndyke," said I, "is unmoved by any catastrophe, and he not only regards the decline and fall off of the medical jurist with philosophic calm, but he even favours the relapse, as you call it. He thinks it may be useful to me to study the application of medico-legal methods to general practice." "That sounds rather unpleasant, for the patients, I mean," remarked Miss Haldean. "Very," agreed her aunt. "Most cold-blooded. What sort of man is Dr. Thorndyke? I feel quite curious about him. Is he at all human, for instance?" "He is entirely human," I replied. "The accepted tests of humanity being, as I understand, the habitual adoption of the erect posture in locomotion, and the relative position of the end of the thumb—" "I don't mean that," interrupted Mrs. Haldean. "I mean human in things that matter." "I think those things matter," I rejoined. "Consider, Mrs. Haldean, what would happen if my learned colleague were to be seen in wig and gown, walking towards the law courts in any posture other than the erect. It would be a public scandal." "Don't talk to him, Mabel," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "He is incorrigible. What are you going to do with yourself this morning, Lucy?" Miss Haldean, who had hastily set down her cup to laugh at my imaginary picture of Dr. Thorndyke in the character of a quadruped, considered a moment. "I think I shall sketch that group of birches at the end of Bradham Wood," she said. "Then, in that case," said I can carry your traps for you, for I have to see a patient in Bradham." "He is making the most of his time," remarked Mrs. Haldean maliciously to my hostess. "He knows that when Mr. Winter arrives he will retire into the extreme background." Douglas Winter, whose arrival was expected in the course of the week, was Miss Haldean's fiancé. Their engagement had been somewhat protracted, and was likely to be more so unless one of them received some unexpected accession of means; for Douglas was a subaltern in the Royal Engineers, living, with great difficulty, on his pay, while Lucy Haldean subsisted on an almost invisible allowance left her by an uncle. I was about to reply to Mrs. Haldean when a patient was announced, and, as I finished my breakfast, I made my excuses and left the table. Half an hour later, when I started along the road to the village of Bradham, I had two companions. Master Freddy had joined the party, and he disputed with me the privilege of carrying the traps, with the result that a compromise was effected, by which he carried the camp stool, leaving me in possession of the easel, the bag, and a large bound sketching book. "Where are you going to work this morning?" I asked, when we had trudged on some distance. "Just off the road to the left there, at the edge of the wood, not very far from the house of the mysterious stranger." She glanced at me mischievously as she made this reply, and chuckled with delight when I rose at the bait. "What house do you mean?" I inquired. "Ha!" she exclaimed, "the investigator of mysteries is aroused. He saith, ha! ha! amidst the trumpets, he smelleth the battle afar off." "Explain instantly," I commanded, "or I drop your sketch-book into the very next puddle." "You terrify me," said she, "but I will explain. Only there isn't any mystery except to the bucolic mind. The house is called Lavender Cottage, and it stands alone in the fields behind the wood. A fortnight ago it was let furnished to a stranger named Whitelock, who has taken it for the purpose of studying the botany of the district, and the only really mysterious thing about him is that no one has seen him. All arrangements with the house agent were made by letter, and as far as I can make out, none of the local tradespeople supply him, so he must get his things from a distance, even his bread, which really is rather odd. Now say I am an inquisitive, gossiping country bumpkin." "I was going to," I answered, "but it is no use now." She relieved me of her sketching appliances with pretended indignation, and crossed into the meadow, leaving me to pursue my way alone. And when I presently looked back, she was setting up her easel and stool, gravely assisted by Freddy. My round, though not a long one, took up more time than I had anticipated, and it was already past the luncheon hour when I passed the place where I had left Miss Haldean. She was gone, as I had expected, and I hurried homewards, anxious to be as nearly punctual as possible. When I entered the dining-room, I found Mrs. Haldean and our hostess seated at the table, and both looked up at me expectantly. "Have you seen Lucy?" the former inquired. "No," I answered. "Hasn't she come back? I expected to find her here. She had left the wood when I passed just now." Mrs. Haldean knitted her brows anxiously. "It is very strange," she said, "and very thoughtless of her. Freddy will be famished." I hurried over my lunch, for 2 fresh messages had come in from outlying hamlets, effectually dispelling my visions of a quiet afternoon; and as the minutes passed without bringing any signs of the absentees, Mrs. Haldean became more and more restless and anxious. At length her suspense became unbearable. She rose suddenly, announcing her intention of cycling up the road to look for the defaulters. But as she was moving towards the door, it burst open, and Lucy Haldean staggered into the room. Her appearance filled us with alarm. She was deadly pale, breathless, and wild-eyed. Her dress was draggled and torn, and she trembled from head to foot. "Good God, Lucy!" gasped Mrs. Haldean. "What has happened? And where is Freddy?" she added in a sterner tone. "He is lost!" replied Miss Haldean in a faint voice, and with a catch in her breath. "He strayed away while I was painting. I have searched the wood through, and called to him, and looked in all the meadows. Oh, where can he have gone?" Her sketching kit, with which she was loaded, slipped from her grasp and rattled on the floor, and she buried her face in her hands and sobbed hysterically. "And you have dared to come back without him?" exclaimed Mrs. Haldean. "I was getting exhausted. I came back for help," was the faint reply. "Of course she was exhausted," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "Come, Lucy, come, Mabel, don't make mountains out of molehills. The little man is safe enough. We shall find him presently, or he will come home by himself. Come and have some food, Lucy." Miss Haldean shook her head. "I can't, Mrs. Hanshaw, really I can't," she said, and seeing that she was in a state of utter exhaustion, I poured out a glass of wine and made her drink it. Mrs. Haldean darted from the room, and returned immediately, putting on her hat. "You have got to come with me and show me where you lost him," she said. "She can't do that, you know," I said rather brusquely. "She will have to lie down for the present. But I know the place, and will cycle up with you." "Very well," replied Mrs. Haldean. "That will do. What time was it," she asked, turning to her niece, "when you lost the child? And which way—" She paused abruptly, and I looked at her in surprise. She had suddenly turned ashen and ghastly. Her face had set like a mask of stone, with parted lips and staring eyes that were fixed in horror on her niece. There was a deathly silence for a few seconds. Then, in a terrible voice, she demanded, "What is that on your dress, Lucy?" And after a pause, her voice rose to a shriek. "What have you done to my boy?" I glanced in astonishment at the dazed and terrified girl, and then I saw what her aunt had seen: a good-sized bloodstain halfway down the front of her skirt, and another smaller one on her right sleeve. The girl herself looked down at the sinister patch of red, and then up at her aunt. "It looks like blood," she stammered. "Yes, it is. I think. Of course it is. He struck his nose, and it bled. Come, interrupted Mrs. Haldean, let us go. And she rushed from the room, leaving me to follow. I lifted Miss Haldean, who was half fainting with fatigue and agitation, onto the sofa, and, whispering a few words of encouragement into her ear, turned to Mrs. Hanshaw. I can't stay with Miss Haldean, I said. There are 2 visits to be made at Redworth. Will you send the dog-cart up the road, with somebody to take my place? Yes, she answered. I will send Giles, or come myself if Lucy is fit to be left. I ran to the stables for my bicycle, and as I pedalled out into the road I could see Mrs. Haldean already far ahead, driving her machine at frantic speed. I followed at a rapid pace, but it was not until we approached the commencement of the wood, when she slowed down somewhat, that I overtook her. This is the place, I said, as we reached the spot where I had parted from Miss Haldean. We dismounted and wheeled our bicycles through the gate, and laying them down beside the hedge, crossed the meadow and entered the wood. It was a terrible experience, and one that I shall never forget. The white-faced, distracted woman tramping in her flimsy house-shoes over the rough ground, bursting through the bushes regardless of the thorny branches that dragged at skin and hair and dainty clothing, and sending forth from time to time a tremulous cry, so dreadfully pathetic in its mingling of terror and coaxing softness, that a lump rose in my throat, and I could barely keep my self-control. "Freddie, Freddie boy, Mummy's here, darling." The wailing cry sounded through the leafy solitude, but no answer came save the whir of wings or the chatter of startled birds. But even more shocking than that terrible cry, more disturbing and eloquent with dreadful suggestion, was the way in which she peered, furtively, but with fearful expectation, among the roots of the bushes, or halted to gaze upon every molehill and hummock, every depression or disturbance of the ground. As we stumbled on for a while, with never a word spoken, until we came to a beaten track or footpath leading across the wood. Here I paused to examine the footprints, of which several were visible in the soft earth, though none seemed very recent. But, proceeding a little way down the track, I perceived, crossing it, a set of fresh imprints, which I recognised at once as Miss Haldean's. She was wearing, as I knew, a pair of brown golf boots, with rubber pads in their leather soles, and the prints made by them were unmistakable. "Miss Haldean crossed the path here," I said, pointing to the footprints. "Don't speak of her before me," exclaimed Mrs. Haldean, but she gazed eagerly at the footprints nevertheless, and immediately plunged into the wood to follow the tracks. "You are very unjust to your niece, Mrs. Haldean," I ventured to protest. She halted and faced me with an angry frown. "You don't understand," she exclaimed. "You don't know, perhaps, that if my poor child is really dead, Lucy Haldean will be a rich woman, and may marry tomorrow if she chooses." "I did not know that," I answered, "but if I had, I should have said the same." "Of course you would," she retorted bitterly. "A pretty face can muddle any man's judgment." She turned away abruptly to resume her pursuit, and I followed in silence. The trail which we were following zigzagged through the thickest part of the wood, but its devious windings eventually brought us out onto an open space on the farther side. Here we at once perceived traces of another kind. A litter of dirty rags, pieces of paper, scraps of stale bread, bones and feathers with hoof marks, wheel ruts, and the ashes of a large wood fire pointed clearly to a gipsy encampment recently broken up. I laid my hand on the heap of ashes and found it still warm, and on scattering it with my foot, a layer of glowing cinders appeared at the bottom. "These people have only been gone an hour or two," I said. "It would be well to have them followed without delay." A gleam of hope shone on the drawn white face, as the bereaved mother caught eagerly at my suggestion. "Yes," she exclaimed breathlessly, "she may have bribed them to take him away. Let us see which way they went." We followed the wheel tracks down to the road and found that they turned towards London. At the same time, I perceived the dog-cart in the distance, with Mrs. Hanshaw standing beside it, and, as the coachman observed me, he whipped up his horse and approached. "I shall have to go," I said, "but Mrs. Hanshaw will help you to continue the search." "And you will make inquiries about the gipsies, won't you?" she said. I promised to do so, and as the dog-cart now came up, I climbed to the seat and drove off briskly up the London road. The extent of a country doctor's round is always an unknown quantity. On the present occasion I picked up 3 additional patients, and as one of them was a case of incipient pleurisy, which required to have the chest strapped, and another was a neglected dislocation of the shoulder, a great deal of time was taken up. Moreover, the gipsies, whom I ran to earth on Rebworth Common, delayed me considerably, though I had to leave the rural constable to carry out the actual search, and, as a result, the clock of Burling Church was striking 6 as I drove through the village on my way home. I got down at the front gate, leaving the coachman to take the dog-cart round, and walked up the drive; and my astonishment may be imagined when, on turning the corner, I came suddenly upon the inspector of the local police in earnest conversation with no less a person than John Thorndyke. "What on earth has brought you here?" I exclaimed, my surprise getting the better of my manners. "The ultimate motive force," he replied, "was an impulsive lady named Mrs. Haldean. She telegraphed for me in your name." "She oughtn't to have done that," I said. "Perhaps not, but the ethics of an agitated woman are not worth discussing, and she has done something much worse. She has applied to the local J.P., a retired Major General, and our gallant and unlearned friend has issued a warrant for the arrest of Lucy Haldean on the charge of murder." "But there has been no murder!" I exclaimed. "That," said Thorndyke, "is a legal subtlety that he does not appreciate. He has learned his law in the orderly room, where the qualifications to practice are an irritable temper and a loud voice. However, the practical point is, Inspector, that a warrant is irregular. You can't arrest people for hypothetical crimes." The officer drew a deep breath of relief. He knew all about the irregularity, and now joyfully took refuge behind Thorndyke's great reputation. When he departed, with a brief note from my colleague to the General, Thorndyke slipped his arm through mine, and we strolled towards the house. "This is a grim business, Jervis," said he. "That boy has got to be found for everybody's sake. Can you come with me when you have had some food?" "Of course I can. I have been saving myself all the afternoon with a view to continuing the search." "Good," said Thorndyke. "Then come in and feed." A nondescript meal, half tea and half dinner, was already prepared, and Mrs. Hanshaw, grave but self-possessed, presided at the table. "Mabel is still out with Giles, searching for the boy," she said. "You have heard what she has done?" I nodded. "It was dreadful of her," continued Mrs. Hanshaw. "She is half mad, poor thing. You might run up and say a few kind words to poor Lucy while I make the tea." I went up at once and knocked at Miss Haldean's door, and, being bidden to enter, found her lying on the sofa, red-eyed and pale, the very ghost of the merry laughing girl who had gone out with me in the morning. I drew up a chair and sat down by her side, and as I took the hand she held out to me, she said, "It is good of you to come and see a miserable wretch like me. And Jane has been so sweet to me, Dr. Jervis. But Aunt Mabel thinks I have killed Freddie. You know she does. And it was really my fault that he was lost. I shall never forgive myself." She burst into a passion of sobbing, and I proceeded to chide her gently. "You are a silly little woman," I said, "to take this nonsense to heart as you are doing. Your aunt is not responsible just now, as you must know, and when we bring the boy home, she shall make you a handsome apology. I will see to that." She pressed my hand gratefully, and as the bell now rang for tea, I bade her have courage and went downstairs. "You need not trouble about the practice," said Mrs. Hanshaw, as I concluded my lightning repast, and Thorndyke went off to get our bicycles. "Dr. Simons has heard of our trouble, and has called to say that he will take anything that turns up, so we shall expect you when we see you." "How do you like Thorndyke?" I asked. "He is quite charming," she replied enthusiastically. "So tactful and kind, and so handsome too. You didn't tell us that. But here he is. Goodbye and good luck." She pressed my hand, and I went out into the drive, where Thorndyke and the coachman were standing with 3 bicycles. "I see you have brought your outfit," I said as we turned into the road, for Thorndyke's machine bore a large canvas-covered case strapped on with a strong bracket. "Yes, there are many things that we may want on a quest of this kind. How did you find Miss Haldean?" "Very miserable, poor girl. By the way, have you heard anything about her pecuniary interest in the child's death?" "Yes," said Thorndyke. "It appears that the late Mr. Haldean used up all his brains on his business, and had none left for the making of his will, as often happens. He left almost the whole of his property, about £80,000, to his son, the widow to have a life interest in it. He also left to his late brother's daughter, Lucy, £50 a year, and to his surviving brother, Percy, who seems to have been a good-for-nothing, 100 a year for life. But, and here is the utter folly of the thing, if the son should die, the property was to be equally divided between the brother and the niece, with the exception of 500 a year for life for the widow. It was an insane arrangement." "Quite," I agreed. "And a very dangerous one for Lucy Haldean, as things are at present." "Very, especially if anything should have happened to the child." "What are you going to do now?" I inquired, seeing that Thorndyke rode on as if with a definite purpose. "There is a footpath through the wood," he replied. "I want to examine that. And there is a house behind the wood which I should like to see." "The house of the mysterious stranger," I suggested. "Precisely. Mysterious and solitary strangers invite inquiry." We drew up at the entrance to the footpath, leaving Willett the coachman in charge of the 3 machines, and proceeded up the narrow track. As we went, Thorndyke looked back at the prints of our feet, and nodded approvingly. "This soft loam," he remarked, "yields beautifully clear impressions, and yesterday's rain has made it perfect." We had not gone far when we perceived a set of footprints which I recognised, as did Thorndyke also, for he remarked, "Miss Haldean, running and alone." Presently we met them again, crossing in the opposite direction, together with the prints of small shoes with very high heels. "Mrs. Haldean on the track of her niece," was Thorndyke's comment, and a minute later we encountered them both again, accompanied by my own footprints. "The boy does not seem to have crossed the path at all," I remarked as we walked on, keeping off the track itself to avoid confusing the footprints. "We shall know when we have examined the whole length," replied Thorndyke, plodding on with his eyes on the ground. "Ha! Here is something new," he added, stopping short and stooping down eagerly. "A man with a thick stick. A smallish man, rather lame. Notice the difference between the 2 feet, and the peculiar way in which he uses his stick? Yes, Jervis, there is a great deal to interest us in these footprints. Do you notice anything very suggestive about them?" "Nothing but what you have mentioned," I replied. "What do you mean?" "Well, first there is the very singular character of the prints themselves, which we will consider presently. You observe that this man came down the path, and at this point turned off into the wood. Then he returned from the wood and went up the path again. The imposition of the prints makes that clear. But now look at the 2 sets of prints and compare them. Do you notice any difference?" "The returning footprints seem more distinct, better impressions." "Yes, they are noticeably deeper. But there is something else." He produced a spring tape from his pocket and took 6 measurements. "You see," he said, "the first set of footprints have a stride of 21 inches from heel to heel. A short stride, but he is a smallish man, and lame. The returning ones have a stride of only 19½ inches. Hence the returning footprints are deeper than the others, and the steps are shorter. What do you make of that?" "It would suggest he was carrying a burden when he returned," I replied. "Yes, and a heavy one, to make that difference in the depth. I think I will get you to go and fetch Willett and the bicycles." I strode off down the path to the entrance, and taking possession of Thorndyke's machine, with its precious case of instruments, bade Willett follow with the other two. When I returned, my colleague was standing with his hands behind him, gazing with intense preoccupation at the footprints. He looked up sharply as we approached, and called out to us to keep off the path if possible. "Stay here with the machines, Willett," said he. "You and I, Jervis, must go and see where our friend went to when he left the path, and what was the burden that he picked up." We struck off into the wood, where last year's dead leaves made the footprints almost undistinguishable, and followed the faint double track for a long distance between the dense clumps of bushes. Suddenly my eye caught, beside the double trail, a third row of tracks, smaller in size and closer together. Thorndyke had seen them too, and already his measuring tape was in his hand. 11½ inches to the stride," said he. "That will be the boy, Jervis. But the light is getting weak. We must press on quickly, or we shall lose it." Some 50 yards farther on, the man's tracks ceased abruptly, but the small ones continued alone, and we followed them as rapidly as we could in the fading light. "There can be no reasonable doubt that these are the child's tracks," said Thorndyke, "but I should like to find a definite footprint to make the identification absolutely certain." A few seconds later he halted with an exclamation and stooped on one knee. A little heap of fresh earth from the surface burrow of a mole had been thrown up over the dead leaves, and fairly planted on it was the clean and sharp impression of a diminutive foot, with a rubber heel showing a central star. Thorndyke drew from his pocket a tiny shoe, and pressed it on the soft earth beside the footprint, and when he raised it, the second impression was identical with the first. "The boy had 2 pairs of shoes exactly alike," he said, "so I borrowed one of the duplicate pair." He turned and began to retrace his steps rapidly, following our own fresh tracks, and stopping only once to point out the place where the unknown man had picked the child up. When we regained the path, we proceeded without delay until we emerged from the wood within 100 yards of the cottage. "I see Mrs. Haldean has been here with Giles," remarked Thorndyke, as he pushed open the garden gate. "I wonder if they saw anybody." He advanced to the door, and having first rapped with his knuckles and then kicked at it vigorously, tried the handle. "Locked," he observed, "but I see the key is in the lock, so we can get in if we want to. Let us try the back." The back door was locked too, but the key had been removed. "He came out this way, evidently," said Thorndyke, "though he went in at the front, as I suppose you noticed. Let us see where he went." The back garden was a small, fenced patch of ground, with an earth path leading down to the back gate. A little way beyond the gate was a small barn or outhouse. "We are in luck," Thorndyke remarked with a glance at the path. "Yesterday's rain has cleared away all old footprints, and prepared the surface for new ones. You see there are 3 sets of excellent impressions, 2 leading away from the house and 1 set towards it. Now you notice that both of the sets leading from the house are characterized by deep impressions and short steps, while the set leading to the house has lighter impressions and longer steps. The obvious inference is that he went down the path with a heavy burden, came back empty-handed, and went down again, and finally, with another heavy burden. You observe, too, that he walked with his stick on each occasion." By this time we had reached the bottom of the garden. Opening the gate, we followed the tracks towards the outhouse, which stood beside a cart track. But as we came round the corner, we both stopped short and looked at one another. On the soft earth were the very distinct impressions of the tyres of a motor car leading from the wide door of the outhouse. Finding that the door was unfastened, Thorndyke opened it and looked in, to satisfy himself that the place was empty. Then he fell to studying the tracks. "The course of events is pretty plain," he observed. "First the fellow brought down his luggage, started the engine, and got the car out. You can see where it stood, both by the little pool of oil and by the widening and blurring of the wheel tracks from the vibration of the free engine. Then he went back and fetched the boy, carried him pick-a-back, I should say, judging by the depth of the toe mark in the last set of footprints. That was a tactical mistake. He should have taken the boy straight into the shed. He pointed as he spoke to one of the footprints beside the wheel tracks, from the toe of which projected a small segment of the print of a little rubber heel. We now made our way back to the house, where we found Willett pensively rapping at the front door with a cycle spanner. Thorndyke took a last glance, with his hand in his pocket, at an open window above, and then, to the coachman's intense delight, brought forth what looked uncommonly like a small bunch of skeleton keys. One of these he inserted into the keyhole, and as he gave it a turn, the lock clicked, and the door stood open. The little sitting-room which we now entered was furnished with the barest necessaries. Its centre was occupied by an oilcloth-covered table, on which I observed with surprise a dismembered B clock, the works of which had been taken apart with a tin opener that lay beside them, and a boxwood bird-call. At these objects Thorndyke glanced and nodded, as though they fitted into some theory that he had formed, examined carefully the oilcloth around the litter of wheels and pinions, and then proceeded on a tour of inspection round the room, peering inquisitively into the kitchen and store-cupboard. "Nothing very distinctive or personal here," he remarked. "Let us go upstairs." There were 3 bedrooms on the upper floor, of which 2 were evidently disused, though the windows were wide open. The 3rd bedroom showed manifest traces of occupation, though it was as bare as the others, for the water still stood in the wash-hand basin, and the bed was unmade. To the latter Thorndyke advanced, and having turned back the bedclothes, examined the interior attentively, especially at the foot and the pillow. The latter was soiled, not to say grimy, though the rest of the bed linen was quite clean. "Hair dye," remarked Thorndyke, noting my glance at it. Then he turned and looked out of the open window. "Can you see the place where Miss Haldean was sitting to sketch?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "There is the place well in view, and you can see right up the road. I had no idea this house stood so high. From the 3 upper windows you can see all over the country excepting through the wood." "Yes," Thorndyke rejoined, "and he has probably been in the habit of keeping watch up here with a telescope or a pair of field glasses. Well, there is not much of interest in this room. He kept his effects in a cabin trunk which stood there under the window. He shaved this morning. He has a white beard, to judge by the stubble on the shaving paper, and that is all. Wait, though. There is a key hanging on that nail. We must have overlooked that, for it evidently does not belong to this house. It is an ordinary town latchkey." He took the key down, and having laid a sheet of notepaper from his pocket on the dressing-table, produced a pin with which he began carefully to probe the interior of the key-barrel. Presently there came forth, with much coaxing, a large ball of grey fluff, which Thorndyke folded up in the paper with infinite care. "I suppose we mustn't take away the key," he said, "but I think we will take a wax mould of it." He hurried downstairs, and unstrapping the case from his bicycle, brought it in and placed it on the table. As it was now getting dark, he detached the acetylene lamp from his machine, and having lighted it, proceeded to open the mysterious case. First he took from it a small insufflator, or powder-blower, with which he blew a cloud of light yellow powder over the table around the remains of the clock. The powder settled on the table in an even coating, but when he blew at it smartly with his breath, it cleared off, leaving, however, a number of smeary impressions which stood out in strong yellow against the black oilcloth. To one of these impressions he pointed significantly. It was the print of a child's hand. He next produced a small portable microscope and some glass slides and cover slips, and having opened the paper and tipped the ball of fluff from the key barrel onto the slide, set to work with a pair of mounted needles to tease it out into its component parts. Then he turned the light of the lamp onto the microscope mirror and proceeded to examine the specimen. "A curious and instructive assortment this, Jervis," he remarked, with his eye at the microscope. "Woolen fibres, no cotton or linen. He is careful of his health to have woolen pockets. And 2 hairs, very curious ones too. Just look at them, and observe the root bulbs." I applied my eye to the microscope, and saw, among other things, 2 hairs, originally white, but encrusted with a black, opaque, glistening stain. The root bulbs, I noticed, were shriveled and atrophied. "But how on earth," I exclaimed, "did the hairs get into his pocket?" "I think the hairs themselves answer the question," he replied, "when considered with the other curios. The stain is obviously lead sulphide, but what else do you see?" "I see some particles of metal, a white metal apparently, and a number of fragments of woody fibre and starch granules, but I don't recognise the starch. It is not wheat starch, nor rice, nor potato. Do you make out what it is?" Thorndyke chuckled. "Experientia does it," he said. "You will have, Jervis, to study the minute properties of dust and dirt. Their evidential value is immense. Let us have another look at that starch. It is all alike, I suppose." It was, and Thorndyke had just ascertained the fact when the door burst open and Mrs. Haldean entered the room, followed by Mrs. Hanshaw and the police inspector. The former lady regarded my colleague with a glance of extreme disfavour. "We heard that you had come here, sir," she said, "and we supposed you were engaged in searching for my poor child. But it seems we were mistaken, since we find you here amusing yourself fiddling with these nonsensical instruments." "Perhaps, Mabel," said Mrs. Hanshaw stiffly, "it would be wiser and infinitely more polite to ask if Dr. Thorndyke has any news for us." "That is undoubtedly so, madam," agreed the inspector, who had apparently suffered also from Mrs. Haldean's impulsiveness. "Then perhaps," the latter lady suggested, "you will inform us if you have discovered anything." "I will tell you," replied Thorndyke, "all that we know. The child was abducted by the man who occupied this house, and who appears to have watched him from an upper window, probably through a glass. This man lured the child into the wood by blowing his bird call. He met him in the wood and induced him, by some promises no doubt, to come with him. He picked the child up and carried him, on his back I think, up to the house, and brought him in through the front door, which he locked after him. He gave the boy this clock and the bird call to amuse him while he went upstairs and packed his trunk. He took the trunk out through the back door and down the garden to the shed there, in which he had a motor car. He got the car out and came back for the boy, whom he carried down to the car, locking the back door after him. Then he drove away." "You know he has gone," cried Mrs. Haldean, "and yet you stay here playing with these ridiculous toys. Why are you not following him?" "We have just finished ascertaining the facts," Thorndyke replied calmly, "and should by now be on the road if you had not come." Here the inspector interposed anxiously. "Of course, sir, you can't give any description of the man. You have no clue to his identity, I suppose?" "We have only his footprints," Thorndyke answered, "and this fluff which I raked out of the barrel of his latchkey and have just been examining. From these data I conclude that he is a rather short and thin man and somewhat lame. He walks with the aid of a thick stick, which has a knob, not a crook, at the top, and which he carries in his left hand. I think that his left leg has been amputated above the knee, and that he wears an artificial limb. He is elderly, he shaves his beard, has white hair dyed a greyish black, is partly bald, and probably combs a wisp of hair over the bald place. He takes snuff and carries a leaden comb in his pocket." As Thorndyke's description proceeded, the inspector's mouth gradually opened wider and wider, until he appeared the very type and symbol of astonishment. But its effect on Mrs. Haldean was much more remarkable. Rising from her chair, she leaned on the table and stared at Thorndyke with an expression of awe, even of terror, and as he finished, she sank back into her chair with her hands clasped and turned to Mrs. Hanshaw. "Jane!" she gasped. "It is Percy, my brother-in-law. He has described him exactly, even to his stick and his pocket-comb. But I thought he was in Chicago." "If that is so," said Thorndyke, hastily repacking his case, "we had better start at once." "We have the dog-cart in the road," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "Thank you," replied Thorndyke. "We will ride on our bicycles, and the inspector can borrow Willet's. We go out at the back by the cart track, which joins the road farther on." "Then we will follow in the dog-cart," said Mrs. Haldean. "Come, Jane." The two ladies departed down the path, while we made ready our bicycles and lit our lamps. With your permission, Inspector," said Thorndyke, "we will take the key with us." "It's hardly legal, sir," objected the officer. "We have no authority." "It is quite illegal," answered Thorndyke, "but it is necessary, and necessity, like your military J.P., knows no law." The inspector grinned and went out, regarding me with a quivering eyelid, as Thorndyke locked the door with his skeleton key. As we turned into the road, I saw the light of the dog-cart behind us, and we pushed forward at a swift pace, picking up the trail easily on the soft, moist road. "What beats me," said the inspector confidentially, as we rode along, "is how he knew the man was bald. Was it the footprints or the latchkey? And that comb, too, that was a regular knockout." These points were, by now, pretty clear to me. I had seen the hairs with the atrophied bulbs, such as one finds at the margin of a bald patch, and the comb was used, evidently, for the double purpose of keeping the bald patch covered and blackening the sulphur-charged hair. But the knobbed stick and the artificial limb puzzled me so completely that I presently overtook Thorndyke to demand his explanation. "The stick," said he, "is perfectly simple. The ferrule of a knobbed stick wears evenly all round. That of a crooked stick wears on one side, the side opposite the crook. The impressions showed that the ferrule of this one was evenly convex, therefore it had no crook. The other matter is more complicated. To begin with, an artificial foot makes a very characteristic impression owing to its purely passive elasticity, as I will show you tomorrow. But an artificial leg fitted below the knee is quite secure, whereas one fitted above the knee, that is, with an artificial knee joint worked by a spring, is much less reliable. Now this man had an artificial foot, and he evidently distrusted his knee joint, as is shown by his steadying it with his stick on the same side. If he had merely had a weak leg, he would have used the stick with his right hand, with the natural swing of the arm in fact, unless he had been very lame, which he evidently was not. Still, it was only a question of probability, though the probability was very great. Of course, you understand that those particles of woody fibre and starch granules were disintegrated snuff grains. This explanation, like the others, was quite simple when one had heard it, though it gave me material for much thought as we pedalled on along the dark road, with Thorndyke's light flickering in front, and the dog-cart pattering in our wake. But there was ample time for reflection, for our pace rather precluded conversation, and we rode on, mile after mile, until my legs ached with fatigue. On and on we went, through village after village, now losing the trail in some frequented street, but picking it up again unfailingly as we emerged onto the country road, until at last, in the paved high street of the little town of Horsefield, we lost it for good. We rode on through the town, out on to the country road, but although there were several tracks of motors, Thorndyke shook his head at them all. "I have been studying those tyres until I know them by heart," he said. "No, either he is in the town, or he has left it by a side road." There was nothing for it but to put up the horse and the machines at the hotel, while we walked round to reconnoitre, and this we did, tramping up one street and down another, with eyes bent on the ground, fruitlessly searching for a trace of the missing car. Suddenly, at the back of a blacksmith's shop, Thorndyke halted. The shop had been kept open late for the shoeing of a carriage horse, which was just being led away, and the smith had come to the door for a breath of air. Thorndyke accosted him genially. "Good evening. You are just the man I wanted to see. I have mislaid the address of a friend of mine, who, I think, called on you this afternoon. A lame gentleman who walks with a stick. I expect he wanted you to pick a lock or make him a key." "Oh, I remember him," said the man. "Yes, he had lost his latchkey, and wanted the lock picked before he could get into his house. Had to leave his motor car outside while he came here, but I took some keys round with me, and fitted one to his latch." He then directed us to the house at the end of a street close by, and, having thanked him, we went off in high spirits. "How did you know he had been there?" I asked. "I didn't, but there was the mark of a stick and part of a left foot on the soft earth outside the doorway, and the thing was inherently probable, so I risked a false shot." The house stood alone at the far end of a straggling street, and was enclosed by a high wall, in which, on the side facing the street, was a door and a wide carriage gate. Advancing to the former, Thorndyke took from his pocket the purloined key, and tried it in the lock. It fitted perfectly, and when he had turned it and pushed open the door, we entered a small courtyard. Crossing this, we came to the front door of the house, the latch of which fortunately fitted the same key, and this having been opened by Thorndyke, we trooped into the hall. Immediately we heard the sound of an opening door above, and a reedy, nasal voice sang out, "Hello there! Who's that below?" The voice was followed by the appearance of a head projecting over the baluster rail. "You are Mr. Percy Haldane, I think," said the inspector. At the mention of his name, the head was withdrawn, and a quick tread was heard, accompanied by the tapping of a stick on the floor. We started to ascend the stairs, the inspector leading, as the authorised official. But we had only gone up a few steps when a fierce, wiry little man danced out onto the landing, with a thick stick in one hand and a very large revolver in the other. "Move another step, either of you," he shouted, pointing the weapon at the inspector, "and I let fly, and mind you, when I shoot, I hit." He looked as if he meant it, and we accordingly halted with remarkable suddenness, while the inspector proceeded to parley. "Now what's the good of this, Mr. Haldane?" said he. "The game's up, and you know it." "You clear out of my house, and step out sharp," was the inhospitable rejoinder, "or you'll give me the trouble of burying you in the garden." I looked round to consult with Thorndyke, when, to my amazement, I found that he had vanished, apparently through the open hall door. I was admiring his discretion when the inspector endeavoured to reopen negotiations, but was cut short abruptly. "I'm going to count to 50, said Mr. Haldane, "and if you aren't gone then, I shall shoot." He began to count deliberately, and the inspector looked round at me in complete bewilderment. The flight of stairs was a long one, and well lighted by gas, so that to rush it was an impossibility. Suddenly my heart gave a bound and I held my breath, for out of an open door behind our quarry a figure emerged slowly and noiselessly onto the landing. It was Thorndyke, shoeless and in his shirt sleeves. Slowly and with cat-like stealthiness he crept across the landing until he was within a yard of the unconscious fugitive, and still the nasal voice droned on, monotonously counting out the allotted seconds. 41, 42, 43. There was a lightning-like movement, a shout, a flash, a bang, a shower of falling plaster, and then the revolver came clattering down the stairs. The inspector and I rushed up, and in a moment the sharp click of the handcuffs told Mr. Percy Haldane that the game was really up. 5 minutes later, Freddy boy, half asleep, but wholly cheerful, was borne by Thorndyke's shoulders into the private sitting-room of the Black Horse Hotel. A shriek of joy saluted his entrance, and a shower of maternal kisses brought him to the verge of suffocation. Finally, the impulsive Mrs. Haldane, turning suddenly to Thorndyke, seized both his hands, and for a moment I hoped that she was going to kiss him too, but he was spared, and I have not yet recovered from the disappointment. End of The Stranger's Latchkey by R. Austin Freeman.
Minutes Musing by Alice Ruth Moore. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Monica Washington, Atlanta. There was a terrible noise in the schoolyard at intermission. Peeping out the windows, the boys could be seen, huddled in an immense bunch in the middle of the yard. It looked like a fight, a mob, a knockdown, anything. So we rushed out to the door, hastily, fearfully, ready to scold, punish, console, frown, bind up broken heads, or drag wounded forms from the melee, as the case might be. Nearly every boy in the school was in that seething, swarming mass, and those who weren't were standing around on the edges, screaming, throwing up their hats in hilarious excitement. It was a mob, a fearful mob, but a mob apparently with a vigorous and well-defined purpose. It was a mob that screamed and howled and kicked and yelled and shouted and perspired and squirmed and wriggled and pushed and threatened and poured itself all seemingly upon some central object. It was a mob that had an aim, that was determined to accomplish that aim, even though the whole azure expanse of sky fell upon them. It was a mob with set muscles, straining like whipcords, eyes on that central object, and with heads inward and sturdy legs outward, like prairie horses, reversed in a battle. The cheerers and hat throwers on the outside were mirthful, but the mob was not. It howled, but howled without any cachinnation. It struggled for mastery. Some fell and were trampled over, some weaker ones were even tossed in the air. But the mob never deigned to trouble itself about such trivialities. It was an interesting nervous whole, with diverse parts of separate vitality. In alarm, I looked about for the principal. He was standing at a safe distance with his hands in his pockets, watching the seething mass with a broad smile. At sight of my perplexed expression, someone was about to venture an explanation when there was a wild yell, a sudden vehement disintegration of the mass, a mighty rush and clutch at a dark object bobbing in the air, and the mist cleared from my intellect as I realized it all. Football. Did you ever stop to see the analogy between a game of football and the interesting little game called life, which we play every day? There is one, far-fetched as it may seem, though, for that matter. Life's game, being one of desperate chances and strategic moves, is analogous to anything. But if we could get out of ourselves and soar above the world far enough to view the mass beneath in its daily struggles, and near enough the hearts of the people to fear the throbs beneath their boldly carried exteriors, the whole would seem naught but such a maddening rush and senseless-looking crushing. We are but children of a larger growth after all, and our ceaseless pursuing after the baubles of this earth are but the struggles for precedence in the business playground. The football is money. See how the mass rushes after it? Everyone so intent upon his pursuit until all else dwindles into a ridiculous nonentity. The weaker ones go down in the mad pursuit and are unmercifully trampled upon, but no matter. What is the difference if the foremost wins the coveted prize and carry it off? See the big boy in front? He with iron grip and determined compressed lips? That boy is a type of the big, merciless man, the Gradgrind of the latter century. His face is set towards the ball, and even though he may crush a dozen small boys, he'll make his way through the mob and come out triumphant. And he'll be the victor longer than anyone else, in spite of the envy and fighting and pushing about him. To an observer, alike unintelligent about the rules of a football game and the conditions which govern the barter and exchange and fluctuations of the world's money market, there is as much difference between the sight of a mass of boys on the playground losing their equilibrium over a spheroid of rubber and a mass of men losing their coolness and temper and mental and nervous balance on change as there is between a pine sapling and a mighty forest king, merely a difference of age. The mighty, seething, intensely concentrated mass in its emphatic tendency to one point is the same, and the utter disregard of mental and physical welfare. The momentary triumphs of transitory possessions impress a casual looker-on with the same fearful idea that the human race, after all, is savage to the core and cultivates its savagery in an inflated happiness at own nearness to perfection. But the bell clangs sharply, the overheated, nervous, tingling boys fall into line, and the sudden transition from massing disorder to military precision cuts short the 10 minutes musing. End of 10 Minutes Musing by Alice Ruth Moore.
The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows by Basil Hall Chamberlain. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows from Aino Folktales by Basil Hall Chamberlain. Two brother foxes consulted together thus: "It would be fun for us to go down among men and assume human shape." So they made treasures, and they made garments out of the leaves of various trees, and they made various things to eat, and cakes out of the gum which comes out of trees. But the Mole God saw them making all these preparations. So the Mole made a place like a human village, and placed himself in it under the disguise of a very old man. The foxes came to that village. They came to the very old man's house, and the Mole himself made beautiful treasures and made garments out of various herbs and leaves of trees. And taking mulberries and grapes from the tops of the trees, he made good food. On the arrival of the foxes, the Mole invited all the crows in the place and all sorts of birds. He gave them human shape, and placed them as owners in the houses of the village. Then the Mole, as chief of the village, was a very old man. Then the foxes came, having assumed the shape of men. They thought the place was a human village. The old chief bought all the things which the foxes had brought on their backs, all their treasures and all their food. Then the old man displayed to them his own beautiful treasures. The old man displayed all his beautiful things, his garments. The foxes were much pleased. Then the old man spoke thus: "Oh, you strangers, as there is a dance in my village, it will be well for you to see it." Then all the people in the village danced all sorts of dances, but at last, owing to their being birds, they began to fly upwards, notwithstanding their human shape. The foxes saw this, and were much amused. The foxes ate both of the mulberries and of the grapes. They tasted very good. It was great fun, too, to see the dancing. Afterwards they went home. The foxes thought thus: "What is nicer even than treasures is the delicious food which human beings have. As we do not know what it is, let us go again and buy some more of it." So they again made treasures out of herbs. Then they again went down to the village. The Mole was in a golden house, a large house. He was alone in it, having sent all the crows and the rest away. As the foxes entered the house and looked about them, they saw a very venerable god. The god spoke thus: "Oh, you foxes, because you had assumed human shape, you made all sorts of counterfeit treasures. I saw all that you did. It is by me, and because of this, that you were brought here. You think this is a human village, but it is the village of me, your master, the Mole. It seems you constantly do all sorts of bad things. If you do so, it is very wrong, so do not assume human shape any more. If you will cease to assume human shape, you may henceforth eat your fill of these mulberries and grapes. You and your companions the crows may eat together of the mulberries and of all fruits at the top of the trees, which the crows cause to drop down. This will be much more profitable for you than to assume human shape." Thus spoke the Mole. Owing to this, the foxes left off assuming human shape, and from that time forward ate as they pleased of the mulberries and the grapes. When the crows let any drop, they went underneath the trees and ate them. They became very friendly together. Translated literally. Told by Ishanashi, 11th November, 1886. End of The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows by Basil Hall Chamberlain. The White Hat by Sax Rohmer, from Tales of Chinatown. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Ferrard. The White Hat by Sax Rohmer. Part 1. Major Jack Ragstaff. "Hullo, Ennis," said Paul Harley as his secretary entered. "Someone is making a devil of a row outside." "This is the offender, Mr. Harley," said Ennis, and handed my friend a visiting card. Glancing at the card, Harley read aloud, "Major J.E.P. Ragstaff, Cavalry Club." Meanwhile, a loud, harsh voice, which would have been audible in a full gale, was roaring in the lobby. "Nonsense!" I could hear the major shouting. "Balderdash! There's more fuss than if I had asked for an interview with the Prime Minister. Piffle! Balderdash!" And his smile developed into a laugh, in which Harley joined. Then, "Admit the major," he said. Into the study where Harley and I had been seated quietly smoking, there presently strode a very choleric Anglo-Indian. He wore a horsey check suit and white spats, and his tie closely resembled a stock. In his hand he carried a heavy Malacca cane, gloves, and one of those tall light gray hats commonly termed white. He was below medium height, slim and wiry. His gait and the shape of his legs, his build, all proclaimed the dragoon. His complexion was purple, and the large white teeth visible beneath a bristling gray mustache added to the natural ferocity of his appearance. Standing just within the doorway, "Mr. Paul Harley?" he shouted. It was apparently an inquiry, but it sounded like a reprimand. My friend, standing before the fireplace, his hands in his pockets and his pipe in his mouth, nodded brusquely. "I am Paul Harley," he said. "Won't you sit down?" Major Ragstaff, glancing angrily at Ennis as the latter left the study, tossed his stick and gloves onto a settee, and drawing up a chair, seated himself stiffly upon it, as though he were in a saddle. He stared straight at Harley, and "You are not the sort of person I expected, sir," he declared. "May I ask if it is your custom to keep clients dancing on the mat and all that on the blasted mat, sir?" Harley suppressed a smile, and I hastily reached for my cigarette case, which I had placed upon the mantel shelf. "I am always naturally pleased to see clients, Major Ragstaff," said Harley, "but a certain amount of routine is necessary even in civilian life. You had not advised me of your visit, and it is contrary to my custom to discuss business after 5 o'clock." As Harley spoke, the major glared at him continuously, and then, "I've seen you in India!" he roared. "Damn, I've seen you in India! And yes, in Turkey. Ha! I've got you now, sir." He sprang to his feet. "You're the Harley who was in Constantinople in 1912." "Quite true." "Then I've come to the wrong shop." "That remains to be seen, Major." "But I was told you were a private detective, and all that." "So I am," said Harley quietly. "In 1912 the Foreign Office was my client. I am now at the service of anyone who cares to employ me." "Hell!" said the major. He seemed to be temporarily stricken speechless by the discovery that a man who had acted for the British government should be capable of stooping to the work of a private inquiry agent. Staring all about the room with a sort of naive wonderment, he drew out a big silk handkerchief and loudly blew his nose, all the time eyeing Harley questioningly. Replacing his handkerchief, he directed his regard upon me, and "This is my friend, Mr. Knox," said Harley. "You may state your case before him without hesitation, unless—" I rose to depart, but "Sit down, Mr. Knox, sit down, sir," shouted the major. "I have no dirty linen to wash, no skeletons in the cupboard, or piffle of that kind. I simply want something explained which I am too thick-headed, too damn thick-headed, sir, to explain myself." He resumed his seat, and taking out his wallet, extracted from it a small newspaper cutting which he offered to Harley. "Read that, Mr. Harley," he directed. "Read it aloud." Harley read as follows: "Before Mr. Smith, at Marlborough Street Police Court, John Edward Bampton was charged with assaulting a well-known clubman in Bond Street on Wednesday evening. It was proved by the constable who made the arrest that robbery had not been the motive of the assault, and Bampton confessed that he bore no grudge against the assailed man, indeed, that he had never seen him before. He pleaded intoxication, and the police surgeon testified that although not actually intoxicated, his breath had smelled strongly of liquor at the time of his arrest. Bampton's employers testified to a hitherto blameless character, and as the charge was not pressed, the man was dismissed with a caution." Having read the paragraph, Harley glanced at the Major with a puzzled expression. "The point of this quite escapes me," he confessed. "Is that so?" said Major Ragstaff. "Is that so, sir? Perhaps you will be good enough to read this." From his wallet he took a second newspaper cutting, smaller than the first, and gummed to a sheet of club note paper. Harley took it and read as follows: "Mr. De Lana, a well-known member of the Stock Exchange, who met with a serious accident recently, is still in a precarious condition." The puzzled look on Harley's face grew more acute, and the Major watched him with an expression which I can only describe as one of fierce enjoyment. "You're thinking I'm a damned old fool, ain't you?" he shouted suddenly. "Scarcely that," said Harley, smiling slightly. "But the significance of these paragraphs is not apparent, I must confess. The man Bampton would not appear to be an interesting character, and since no great damage has been done, his drunken frolic hardly comes within my sphere. Of Mr. De Lana, of the Stock Exchange, I never heard, unless he happens to be a member of the firm of De Lana and Day." "He's not a member of that firm, sir," shouted the Major. "He was, up to 6 o'clock this evening." "What do you mean exactly?" inquired Harley, and the tone of his voice suggested that he was beginning to entertain doubts of the Major's sanity or sobriety. Then: "He's dead," declared the latter. "Dead as the Begum of Bangalore. He died at 6 o'clock. I've just spoken to his widow on the telephone." I suppose I must have been staring very hard at the speaker, and certainly Harley was doing so, for suddenly directing his fierce gaze toward me: "You're completely treed, sir, and so's your friend," shouted Major Ragstaff. "I confess it," replied Harley quietly, "and since my time is of some little value, I would suggest, without disrespect, that you explain the connection, if any, between yourself, the drunken Bampton, and Mr. De Lana of the Stock Exchange, who died, you inform us, at 6 o'clock this evening, as the result, presumably, of injuries received in an accident." "That's what I'm here for," cried Major Ragstaff. "In the first place, then, I am the party, although I saw to it that my name was kept out of print, whom the drunken lunatic assaulted." Harley, pipe in hand, stared at the speaker perplexedly. "Understand me," continued the Major. "I am the person, Jack Ragstaff, he assaulted. I was walking down from my quarters in Maddox Street on my way to dine at the club, same as I do every night of my life, when this flamin' idiot sprang upon me, grabbed my hat" he took up his white hat to illustrate what had occurred "not this one, but one like it, pitched it on the ground and jumped on it." Harley was quite unable to conceal his smiles as the excited old soldier dropped his conspicuous headgear on the floor and indulged in a vigorous pantomime designed to illustrate his statement. "Most extraordinary," said Harley. "What did you do?" "What did I do?" roared the Major. "I gave him a crack on the head with my cane, and I said things to him which couldn't be repeated in court. I punched him, and likewise hoofed him, but the hat was completely done in. Damn crowd collected, hearin' me swearin' and bellowin'. Police and all that. Names and addresses and all that balderdash. Man lugged away to guardroom and me turning up at the club with no hat. Damn ridiculous spectacle at my time of life." "Quite so," said Harley soothingly. "I appreciate your annoyance, but I am utterly at a loss to understand why you have come here, and what all this has to do with Mr. De Lana of the Stock Exchange." "He fell out of the window!" shouted the Major. "Fell out of a window?" "Out of a window, sir. A second floor window 10 yards up a side street. Pitched on his skull. Marvel he wasn't killed outright." A faint expression of interest began to creep into Harley's glance, and "I understand you to mean, Major Ragstaff," he said deliberately, "that while your struggle with the drunken man was in progress, Mr. De Lana fell out of a neighboring window into the street?" "Right!" shouted the Major. "Right, sir." "Do you know this Mr. De Lana?" "Never heard of him in my life until the accident occurred. Seems to me the poor devil leaned out to see the fun and overbalanced. Felt responsible, only natural, and made inquiries. He died at 6 o'clock this evening, sir." "Hm," said Harley reflectively. "I still fail to see where I come in. From what window did he fall?" "Window above a sort of tea shop called Café Dame. Damn silly name. Place on a corner. Don't know name of side street." "Hm. You don't think he was pushed out, for instance?" "Certainly not!" shouted the Major. "He just fell out. But the point is, he's dead." "My dear sir," said Harley patiently, "I don't dispute that point. But what on earth do you want of me?" "I don't know what I want," roared the Major, beginning to walk up and down the room. "But I know I ain't satisfied. Not easy in my mind, sir. I wake up of a night hearing the poor devil's yell as he crashed on the pavement. That's all wrong. I've heard hundreds of death yells, but—" He took up his malacca cane and beat it loudly on the table. "I haven't woke up of a night dreamin' I heard 'em again." "In a word, you suspect foul play?" "I don't suspect anything," cried the other excitedly. "But some one mentioned your name to me at the club, said you could see through concrete and all that. And here I am. There's something wrong, radically wrong. Find out what it is and send the bill to me. Then perhaps I'll be able to sleep in peace." He paused, and again taking out the large silk handkerchief, blew his nose loudly. Harley glanced at me in rather an awed way, and then— "There will be no bill, Major Ragstaff," he said. "But if I can see any possible line of inquiry, I will pursue it and report the result to you." Part two. A curious outrage. "What do you make of it, Harley?" I asked. Paul Harley returned a work of reference to its shelf and stood staring absently across the study. "Our late visitor's history does not help us much," he replied. "A somewhat distinguished army career, and so forth. And his only daughter, Sybil Margaret, married the 5th Marquis of Ireton. She is, therefore, the noted social beauty, the Marchioness of Ireton. Does this suggest anything to your mind?" "Nothing whatever," I said blankly. "Nor to mine," murmured Harley. The telephone bell rang. "Hallo!" called Harley. "Yes? That you, Wessex? Have you got the address? Good. No, I shall remember it. Many thanks. Good bye." He turned to me. "I suggest, Knox," he said, "that we make our call and then proceed to dinner as arranged." Since I was always glad of an opportunity of studying my friend's methods, I immediately agreed, and ere long, leaving the lights of the two big hotels behind, our cab was sliding down the long slope which leads to Waterloo Station. Thence through crowded, slummish high roads we made our way via Lambeth to that dismal thoroughfare, Westminster Bridge Road, with its forbidding, often windowless houses, and its peculiar air of desolation. The house for which we were bound was situated at no great distance from Kensington Park, and telling the cabman to wait, Harley and I walked up a narrow paved path, mounted a flight of steps, and rang the bell beside a somewhat time worn door, above which was an old fashioned fanlight dimly illuminated from within. A considerable interval elapsed before the door was opened by a marvelously untidy servant girl who had apparently been interrupted in the act of blackleading her face. Partly opening the door, she stared at us agape, pushing back wisps of hair from her eyes, and with every movement daubing more of some mysterious black substance upon her countenance. "Is Mr. Bampton in?" asked Harley. "Yus, just come in. I'm cooking his supper." "Tell him that two friends of his have called on rather important business." "All right," said the black-faced one. "What name is it?" "No name. Just say two friends of his." Treating us to a long vacant stare, and leaving us standing on the step, the maid, in whose hand I perceived a greasy fork, shuffled along the passage and began to mount the stairs. An unmistakable odor of frying sausages now reached my nostrils. Harley glanced at me quizzically, but said nothing until the Cinderella came stumbling downstairs again, without returning to where we stood. "Go up," she directed. "Second floor, front. Shut the door, one of you." She disappeared into gloomy depths below as Harley and I, closing the door behind us, proceeded to avail ourselves of the invitation. There was very little light on the staircase, but we managed to find our way to a poorly furnished bed sitting room where a small table was spread for a meal. Beside the table, in a chintz covered armchair, a thick-set young man was seated, smoking a cigarette, and having a copy of the Daily Telegraph upon his knees. He was a very typical lower middle class, nothing in particular young man, but there was a certain truculence indicated by his square jaw, and that sort of self-possession which sometimes accompanies physical strength was evidenced in his manner as, tossing the paper aside, he stood up. "Good evening, Mr. Bampton," said Harley genially. "I take it," pointing to the newspaper, "that you are looking for a new job." Bampton stared, a suspicion of anger in his eyes. Then, meeting the amused glance of my friend, he broke into a smile very pleasing and humorous. He was a fresh colored young fellow with hair inclined to redness, and smiling, he looked very boyish indeed. "I have no idea who you are," he said, speaking with a faint North Country accent, "but you evidently know who I am and what has happened to me." "Got the boot?" asked Harley confidentially. Bampton, tossing the end of his cigarette into the grate, nodded grimly. "You haven't told me your name," he said, "but I think I can tell you your business." He ceased smiling. "Now look here, I don't want any more publicity. If you think you are going to make a funny newspaper story out of me, change your mind as quick as you like. I'll never get another job in London as it is. If you drag me any further into the limelight, I'll never get another job in England." "My dear fellow," replied Harley soothingly, at the same time extending his cigarette case, "you misapprehend the object of my call. I am not a reporter." "What?" said Bampton, pausing in the act of taking a cigarette. "Then what the devil are you?" "My name is Paul Harley, and I am a criminal investigator." He spoke the words deliberately, having his eyes fixed upon the other's face. But although Bampton was palpably startled, there was no trace of fear in his straightforward glance. He took a cigarette from the case and "Thanks, Mr. Harley," he said. "I cannot imagine what business has brought you here." "I have come to ask you two questions," was the reply. "Number one, who paid you to smash Major Ragstaff's white hat? Number two, how much did he pay you?" To these questions I listened in amazement, and my amazement was evidently shared by Bampton. He had been in the act of lighting his cigarette, but he allowed the match to burn down nearly to his fingers, and then dropped it with a muttered exclamation in the fire. Finally, "I don't know how you found out," he said, "but you evidently know the truth. Provided you assure me that you are not out to make a silly season newspaper story, I'll tell you all I know." Harley laid his card on the table, and "Unless the ends of justice demand it," he said, "I give you my word that anything you care to say will go no further. You may speak freely before my friend, Mr. Knox. Simply tell me in as few words as possible what led you to court arrest in that manner." "Right," replied Bampton. "I will. He half closed his eyes, reflectively. "I was having tea in the Lyons' Cafe, to which I always go, last Monday afternoon about 4 o'clock, when a man sat down facing me and got into conversation." "Describe him." "He was a man rather above medium height, I should say about my own build, dark going gray. He had a neat moustache and a short beard, and the look of a man who had traveled a lot. His skin was very tanned, almost as deeply as yours, Mr. Harley. Not at all the sort of chap that goes in there as a rule. After a while he made an extraordinary proposal. At first I thought he was joking. Then, when I grasped the idea that he was serious, I concluded he was mad. He asked me how much a year I earned, and I told him Peters and Peters paid me £150. He said, 'I'll give you a year's salary to knock a man's hat off.'" As Bampton spoke the words he glanced at us with twinkling eyes, but although for my own part I was merely amused, Harley's expression had grown very stern. "Of course I laughed," continued Bampton, "but when the man drew out a fat wallet and counted 10 5-pound notes on the table, I began to think seriously about his proposal. Even supposing he was cracked, it was absolutely money for nothing. 'Of course,' he said, 'you'll lose your job and you may be arrested, but you'll say that you had been out with a few friends and were a little excited, also that you never could stand white hats. Stick to that story, and the balance of £100 will reach you on the following morning.'" I asked him for further particulars, and I asked him why he had picked me for the job. He replied that he had been looking for some time for the right man, a man who was strong enough physically to accomplish the thing, and someone, Bampton's eyes twinkled again, with a dash of the devil in him, but at the same time a man who could be relied upon to stick to his guns and not to give the game away. "You asked me to be brief, and I'll try to be. The man in the white hat was described to me, and the exact time and place of the meeting. I just had to grab his white hat, smash it, and face the music." I agreed. I don't deny that I had a couple of stiff drinks before I set out, but the memory of that £50 locked up here in my room, and the further 100 promised, bucked me up wonderfully. It was impossible to mistake my man. I could see him coming toward me as I waited just outside a sort of little restaurant called the Café Dame. As arranged, I bumped into him, grabbed his hat, and jumped on it. He paused, raising his hand to his head reminiscently. "My man was a bit of a scrapper," he continued, "and he played hell. I've never heard such language in my life, and the way he laid about me with his cane is something I am not likely to forget in a hurry." A crowd gathered naturally, and, also naturally, I was pinched. That didn't matter much. I got off lightly, and although I've been dismissed by Peters and Peters, 20 crisp fivers are locked in my trunk there, with the 10 which I received in the city. Harley checked him, and "May I see the envelope in which they arrived?" he asked. "Sorry," replied Bampton, "but I burned it. I thought it was playing the game to do so. It wouldn't have helped you much, though," he added. "It was an ordinary common envelope, posted in the city, address typewritten, and not a line enclosed." "Registered?" "No." Bampton stood looking at us with a curious expression on his face, and suddenly, "There's one point," he said, "on which my conscience isn't easy. You know about that poor devil who fell out of a window? Well, it would never have happened if I hadn't kicked up a row in the street. There's no doubt he was leaning out to see what the disturbance was about when the accident occurred." "Did you actually see him fall?" asked Harley. "No, he fell from a window several yards behind me in the side street, but I heard him cry out, and as I was lugged off by the police, I heard the bell of the ambulance which came to fetch him." He paused again and stood rubbing his head ruefully. Said Harley. "Was there anything particularly remarkable about this man in the Lyons' Cafe?" Bampton reflected silently for some moments, and then: "Nothing much. He was evidently a gentleman, wore a blue top coat, a dark tweed suit, and what looked like a regimental tie, but I didn't see much of the colors. He was very tanned, as I have said, even to the backs of his hands. And, oh yes, there was one point: he had a gold covered tooth." "Which tooth?" I can't remember, except that it was on the left side, and I always noticed it when he smiled. Did he wear any ring or pin which you would recognize? No. Had he any oddity of speech or voice? No. Just a heavy, drawling manner. He spoke like thousands of other cultured Englishmen. But wait a minute. Yes, there was one other point. Now I come to think of it, his eyes were slightly slanted upward. Harley stared. Like a Chinaman's? Oh, nothing so marked as that, but the same sort of formation. Harley nodded briskly and buttoned up his overcoat. "Thanks, Mr. Bampton," he said. "We will detain you no longer." As we descended the stairs, where the smell of frying sausages had given place to that of something burning, probably the sausages, I was half inclined to think that Major Ragstaff's ideas were traceable to a former touch of the sun. Said Harley, "I begin to believe that he has put us on the track of a highly unusual crime. I am sorry to delay dinner, Knox, but I propose to call at the Café Dame." Part 3. A Criminal Genius. On entering the doorway of the Café Dame, we found ourselves in a narrow passage. In front of us was a carpeted stair, and to the right a glass paneled door communicating with a discreetly lighted little dining room which seemed to be well patronized. Opening the door, Harley beckoned to a waiter, and "I wish to see the proprietor," he said. "Mr. Meyer is engaged at the moment, sir," was the reply. "Where is he?" "In his office upstairs, sir. He will be down in a moment." The waiter hurried away, and Harley stood glancing up the stairs as if in doubt what to do. "I cannot imagine how such a place can pay," he muttered. "The rent must be enormous in this district." But even before he ceased speaking, I became aware of an excited conversation which was taking place in some apartment above. "It's scandalous," I heard, in a woman's shrill voice. "You have no right to keep it. It's not your property, and I'm here to demand that you give it up." A man's voice replied in a voluble, broken English, but I could only distinguish a word here and there. I saw that Harley was interested, for catching my questioning glance, he raised his finger to his lips, enjoining me to be silent. "Oh, that's the game, is it?" continued the female voice. "Of course you know it's blackmail?" A flow of unintelligible words answered this speech. Then, "I shall come back with someone," cried the invisible woman, "who will make you give it up." "Knox," whispered Harley in my ear, "when that woman comes down, follow her. I'm afraid you will bungle the business, and I would not ask you to attempt it if big things were not at stake. Return here. I shall wait." As a matter of fact, his sudden request had positively astounded me. But ere I had time for any reply, a door suddenly banged open above, and a respectable looking woman, who might have been some kind of upper servant, came quickly down the stairs. An expression of intense indignation rested upon her face, and without seeming to notice our presence, she brushed past us and went out into the street. "Off you go, Knox," said Harley. Seeing myself committed to an unpleasant business, I slipped out of the doorway and detected the woman 5 or 6 yards away, hurrying in the direction of Piccadilly. I had no difficulty in following her, for she was evidently unsuspicious of my presence, and when presently she mounted a westward bound bus, I did likewise, but while she got inside, I went on top, and occupied a seat on the near side whence I could observe anyone leaving the vehicle. If I had not known Paul Harley so well, I should have counted the whole business a ridiculous farce, but recognizing that something underlay these seemingly trivial and disconnected episodes, I lighted a cigarette and resigned myself to circumstance. At Hyde Park Corner I saw the woman descending, and when presently she walked up Hamilton Place, I was not far behind her. At the door of an imposing mansion she stopped, and in response to a ring of the bell, the door was opened by a footman, and the woman hurried in. Evidently she was an inmate of the establishment, and conceiving that my duty was done when I had noted the number of the house, I retraced my steps to the corner, and, hailing a taxicab, returned to the Café Dame. On inquiring of the same waiter whom Harley had accosted whether my friend was there, "I think a gentleman is upstairs with Mr. Meyer," said the man. "In his office?" "Yes, sir." Thereupon I mounted the stairs and before a half-open door paused. Harley's voice was audible within, and therefore I knocked and entered. I discovered Harley standing by an American desk. Beside him, in a revolving chair which, with the desk, constituted the principal furniture of a tiny office, sat a man in a dress suit which had palpably not been made for him. He had a sullen and suspiciously Teutonic cast of countenance, and he was engaged in a voluble but hardly intelligible speech as I entered. "Ha, Knox," said Harley, glancing over his shoulder. "Did you manage?" "Yes," I replied. Harley nodded shortly, and turned again to the man in the chair. "I am sorry to give you so much trouble, Mr. Meyer," he said, "but I should like my friend here to see the room above." At this moment my attention was attracted by a singular object which lay upon the desk amongst a litter of bills and accounts. This was a piece of rusty iron bar somewhat less than 3 feet in length, and which once had been painted green. "You are looking at this tragic fragment, Knox," said Harley, taking up the bar. "Of course," he shrugged his shoulders, "it explains the whole unfortunate occurrence. You see there was a flaw in the metal at this end here," he indicated the spot, "and the other end had evidently worn loose in its socket." "But I don't understand." "It will all be made clear at the inquest, no doubt. A most unfortunate thing for you, Mr. Meyer. Most unfortunate," declared the proprietor of the restaurant, extending his thick hands pathetically. "Most ruinous to my business." "We will go upstairs now," said Harley. "You will kindly lead the way, Mr. Meyer, and the whole thing will be quite clear to you, Knox." As the proprietor walked out of the office and upstairs to the second floor, Harley whispered in my ear: "Where did she go?" "Number Hamilton Place," I replied in an undertone. "Good God!" muttered my friend, and clutched my arm so tightly that I winced. "Good God! The master touch, Knox! This crime was the work of a genius with slightly, very slightly, oblique eyes." Opening a door on the second landing, Mr. Meyer admitted us to a small supper room. Its furniture consisted of a round dining table, several chairs, a couch, and very little else. I observed, however, that the furniture, carpet, and a few other appointments were of a character much more elegant than those of the public room below. A window which overlooked the street was open, so that the plush curtains which had been drawn aside moved slightly to and fro in the draught. "The window of the tragedy, Knox," explained Harley. He crossed the room. "If you will stand here beside me you will see the gap in the railing, caused by the breaking away of the fragment which now lies on Mr. Meyer's desk. Some few yards to the left in the street below is where the assault took place, of which we have heard, and the unfortunate Mr. De Lana, who was dining here alone, an eccentric custom of his, naturally ran to the window upon hearing the disturbance, and leaned out, supporting his weight upon the railing. The rail collapsed, and we know the rest." "It will ruin me," groaned Meyer. "It will give bad repute to my establishment." "I fear it will," agreed Harley sympathetically, "unless we can manage to clear up one or two little difficulties which I have observed." "For instance?" He tapped the proprietor on the shoulder confidentially. "Have you any idea, any hazy idea, of the identity of the woman who was dining here with Mr. De Lana on Wednesday night?" The effect of this simple inquiry upon the proprietor was phenomenal. His fat yellow face assumed a sort of leaden hue, and his already prominent eyes protruded abnormally. He licked his lips. "I tell you, already I tell you," he muttered, "that Mr. De Lana he engaged this room every Wednesday and sometimes also Friday, and dine here by himself." "And I tell you," said Harley sweetly, "that you are an inspired liar. You smuggled her out by the side entrance after the accident." "The side entrance?" muttered Meyer. "The side entrance?" "Exactly, the side entrance. There is something else which I must ask you to tell me. Who had engaged this room on Tuesday night, the night before the accident?" The proprietor's expression remained uncomprehending. "And a gentleman," he said. "I never see him before." "Another solitary diner?" suggested Harley. Yes, he is alone all the evening waiting for a friend who does not arrive." "Ah," mused Harley, "alone all the evening, was he? And his friend disappointed him. May I suggest that he was a dark man? Grey at the temples, having a dark beard and moustache, and a very tanned face, his eyes slanted slightly upward?" "Yes, yes!" cried Meyer, and his astonishment was patently unfeigned. "It is a friend of yours?" "A friend of mine, yes," said Harley absently, but his expression was very grim. "What time did he finally leave?" "He waited until after 11 o'clock. The dinner is spoilt. He pays, but does not complain." "No," said Harley musingly, "he had nothing to complain about. One more question, my friend. When the lady escaped hurriedly on Wednesday night, what was it that she left behind, and what price are you trying to extort for returning it?" At that the man collapsed entirely. "Ach Gott!" he cried, and raised his hand to his clammy forehead. "You will ruin me. I am a ruined man. I don't try to extort anything. I run an honest business." "And one of the most profitable in the world," added Harley, "since the days of Thides to our own. Even at Bond Street rentals I assume that a house of assignation is a golden enterprise." "Ah!" groaned Meyer, "I am ruined. So what does it matter? I tell you everything. I know Mr. De Lana, who engages my room regularly, but I don't know who the lady is who meets him here. No, I swear it, but always it is the same lady. When he falls I am downstairs in my office, and I hear him cry out. The lady comes running from the room, and begs of me to get her away without being seen, and to keep all mention of her out of the matter." "What did she pay you?" asked Harley. "Pay me?" muttered Meyer, pulled up thus shortly in the midst of his statement. "Pay you. Exactly. Don't argue. Answer." The man delivered himself of a guttural, choking sound, and finally: "She promised me £100," he confessed hoarsely. "But you surely did not accept a mere promise. Out with it. What did she give you?" "A ring," came the confession at last. "A ring. I see. I will take it with me if you don't mind. And now, finally, what was it that she left behind?" "Ah, Gott!" moaned the man, dropping into a chair and resting his arms upon the table. "It is all a great panic, you see. I hurry her out by the back stair from this landing, and she forgets her bag." "Her bag? Good." "Then I clear away the remains of dinner, so I can say Mr. De Lana is dining alone. It is as much my interest as the lady's." "Of course. I quite understand. I will trouble you no more, Mr. Meyer, except to step into your office and to relieve you of that incriminating evidence, the lady's bag and her ring." Part IV. The Slanting Eyes. "Do you understand, Knox?" said Harley, as the cab bore us toward Hamilton Place. "Do you grasp the details of this cunning scheme?" "On the contrary," I replied, "I am hopelessly at sea." Nevertheless, I had forgotten that I was hungry in the excitement which now claimed me. For although the thread upon which these seemingly disconnected things hung was invisible to me, I recognized that Bampton, the city clerk, the bearded stranger who had made so singular a proposition to him, the white-hatted major, the dead stockbroker, and the mysterious woman whose presence in the case the clear sight of Harley had promptly detected, all were linked together by some subtle chain. I was convinced, too, that my friend held at least one end of that chain in his grip. "In order to prepare your mind for the interview which I hope to obtain this evening," continued Harley, "let me enlighten you upon one or two points which may seem obscure. In the first place, you recognize that anyone leaning out of the window on the second floor would almost automatically rest his weight upon the iron bar which was placed there for that very purpose, since the ledge is unusually low?" "Quite," I replied. "And it also follows that if the bar gave way anyone thus leaning on it would be pitched into the street." "Your reasoning is correct." "But, my dear fellow," said I, "how could such an accident have been foreseen?" "You speak of an accident. This was no accident." One end of the bar had been filed completely through, although the file marks had been carefully concealed with rust and dirt, and the other end had been wrenched out from its socket and then replaced in such a way that anyone leaning upon the bar could not fail to be precipitated into the street. "Good heavens! Then you mean—" "I mean, Knox, that the man who occupied this upper room on the night before the tragedy, the dark man, tanned and bearded, with slightly oblique eyes, spent his time in filing through that bar, in short, in preparing a death trap." I was almost dumbfounded. "But Harley," I said, "assuming that he knew his victim would be the next occupant of the room, how could he know—" I stopped. Suddenly, as if a curtain had been raised, the details of what I now perceived to be a fiendishly cunning murder were revealed to me. "According to his own account, Knox," resumed Harley, "Major Ragstaff regularly passed along that street with military punctuality at the same hour every night. You may take it for granted that the murderer was well aware of this. As a matter of fact, I happen to know that he was. We must also take it for granted that the murderer knew of these little dinners for two which took place in the private room above the Cafe Dame every Wednesday, and sometimes on Friday. Around the figure of the methodical major, with his conspicuous white hat as a sort of focus, was built up one of the most ingenious schemes of murder with which I have ever come in contact. The victim literally killed himself." "But, Harley, the victim might have ignored the disturbance." "That is where I first detected the touch of genius, Knox. He recognized the voice of one of the combatants, or his companion did. Here we are." The cab drew up before the house in Hamilton Place. We alighted, and Harley pressed the bell. The same footman whom I had seen admit the woman opened the door. "Is Lady Ireton at home?" asked Harley. As he uttered the name I literally held my breath. We had come to the house of Major Ragstaff's daughter, the Marchioness of Ireton, one of society's most celebrated and beautiful hostesses, the wife of a peer famed alike as sportsman, soldier, and scholar. "I believe she is dining at home, sir," said the man. "Shall I inquire?" "Be good enough to do so," replied Harley, and gave him a card. "Inform her that I wish to return to her a handbag which she lost a few days ago." The man ushered us into an anteroom opening off the lofty and rather gloomy hall, and as the door closed, "Harley," I said in a stage whisper, "am I to believe—" "Can you doubt it?" returned Harley with a grim smile. A few moments later we were shown into a charmingly intimate little boudoir in which Lady Ireton was waiting to receive us. She was a strikingly handsome brunette, but to night her face, which normally, I think, possessed rich colouring, was almost pallid, and there was a hunted look in her dark eyes which made me wish to be anywhere rather than where I found myself. Without preamble she rose and addressed Harley. "I fail to understand your message, sir," she said, and I admired the imperious courage with which she faced him. "You say you have recovered a handbag which I had lost?" Harley bowed, and from the pocket of his greatcoat took out a silken tasselled bag. "The one which you left in the Cafe Dame, Lady Ireton," he replied. "Here also I have—" From another pocket he drew out a diamond ring, "something which was extorted from you by the fellow Meyer." Without touching her recovered property, Lady Ireton sank slowly down into the chair from which she had arisen, her gaze fixed as if hypnotically upon the speaker. "My friend, Mr. Knox, is aware of all the circumstances," continued the latter, "but he is as anxious as I am to terminate this painful interview. I surmise that what occurred on Wednesday night was this—correct me if I am wrong—while dining with Mr. De Lana, you heard sounds of altercation in the street below. May I suggest that you recognized one of the voices?" Lady Ireton, still staring straight before her at Harley, inclined her head in assent. "I heard my father's voice," she said hoarsely. "Quite so," he continued. "I am aware that Major Ragstaff is your father." He turned to me. "Do you recognize the touch of genius at last?" Then, again addressing Lady Ireton, "You naturally suggested to your companion that he should look out of the window in order to learn what was taking place. The next thing you knew was that he had fallen into the street below?" Lady Ireton shuddered and raised her hands to her face. "It is retribution," she whispered. "I have brought this ruin upon myself, but he does not deserve—" Her voice faded into silence, and "You refer to your husband, Lord Ireton?" said Harley. Lady Ireton nodded, and again recovering power of speech. "It was to have been our last meeting," she said, looking up at Harley. She shuddered, and her eyes blazed into sudden fierceness. Then, clenching her hands, she looked aside. "Oh God, the shame of this hour!" she whispered. And I would have given much to have been spared the spectacle of this proud, erring woman's humiliation. But Paul Harley was scientifically remorseless. I could detect no pity in his glance. "I would give my life willingly to spare my husband the knowledge of what has been," said Lady Ireton in a low, monotonous voice. "3 times I sent my maid to Meyer to recover my bag, but he demanded a price which even I could not pay. Now it is all discovered, and Harry will know." "That, I fear, is unavoidable, Lady Ireton," declared Harley. "May I ask where Lord Ireton is at present?" "He is in Africa after big game," said Harley. "In Africa and after big game? I can offer you one consolation, Lady Ireton. In his own interests, Meyer will stick to his first assertion that Mr. De Lana was dining alone." A strange, horribly pathetic look came into the woman's haunted eyes. "You are not acting for—" she began. "I am acting for no one," replied Harley tersely. "Upon my friend's discretion you may rely as upon my own." "Then why should he ever know?" she whispered. "Why indeed?" murmured Harley. "Since he is in Africa." As we descended the stair to the hall, my friend paused and pointed to a life-sized oil painting by London's most fashionable portrait painter. It was that of a man in the uniform of a guards officer, a dark man, slightly grey at the temples, his face very tanned as if by exposure to the sun. "Having had no occasion for disguise when the portrait was painted," said Harley, "Lord Ireton appears here without the beard, and as he is not represented smiling one cannot see the gold tooth, but the painter, if anything, has accentuated the slanting eyes. You see, the 4th Marquis, the present Lord Ireton's father, married one of the world famous Yen Sun girls, daughters of the mandarin of that name by an Irish wife. Hence the eyes. And hence—" "But, Harley, it was murder!" "Not within the meaning of the law, Knox. It was a recrudescence of Chinese humour. Lord Ireton is officially in Africa, and he went actually after big game. The counsel is not born who could secure a conviction. We are somewhat late, but shall therefore have less difficulty in finding a table at Prince's." End of The White Hat by Sax Rohmer.